We'll begin in a little bit. We have a quorum of 10, so as you can see, we're a little short of that. Our members are lagging despite the fact that there's no other committee hearings this morning. Maybe that's why they're not here. All right, there's 8. The Accountability and Administrative Review Committee is now in session. We're going to start out as a subcommittee until we can establish that quorum. Today's subject is youth crime prevention and juvenile justice funding. We spend about $1.3 billion on youth crime prevention and juvenile justice funded programs. School-based programs overseen by the Department of Education account for about $900 million. Employment-related programs overseen by EDD account for $13 million. Family and foster care programs overseen by the Department of Social Services account for about $6 million. Programs aimed at juvenile offenders overseen by the Correction Standards Authority, a board within the Department of Corrections, account for about $300 million. Anti-gang programs overseen by the California Emergency Management Agency account for $11 million, and juvenile drug court and other school-based programs overseen by the Department of Alcohol and Drug Programs accounted for about $10 million. As you can see here, we have a varied and disparate group of programs. This 42 funding streams, many of these into different departments. By any rational analysis, I think you would say this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Maybe the number is not 3, but it certainly is not 42. And so we wanted to look at this. We also wanted to look at measurements. You have $1.3 billion going out the door for these programs, and we need to make sure that they are being analyzed, that we're getting data back to show whether these programs in fact work. If we're going to spend $1.3 billion on these programs, they all better be working pretty good, especially in light of the cuts that we're making up and down state government. So those are the dual focuses today. One is the kinds of programs that we have and how they're distributed within the administration, how they're administered, and by who. And then secondly, how are they measured? Are we getting results-based analysis for these programs? And clearly, you're not going to get, you're not making widgets here, so you're not going to get very clear data in terms of the outcomes. But there are best practices, there are measurable things that you can show on the inputs to show that you are getting some kind of results in reaching out to young people and making sure that these programs have some recognized effectiveness. Before we launch into it, I wanted to acknowledge that some of the programs we're not going to be looking at today just because they don't kind of fit into what I just described. Some school-based programs that are either federally funded or not solely focused on youth crime prevention and have other primary objectives. We obviously, because of the federal funding component and the requirements that the federal government has, we can't really do a whole lot about that. After-school programs, there is the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, which is a federal program, and the After-School Education and Safety program, which was Prop 49, which many of us remember. Unfortunately, because it was done by the voters, we can't do a whole lot. We will talk about it in passing, but in terms of changing it or doing something about it, can't do a whole lot. In fact, the legislature last year approved AB 1526, which would have created a ballot initiative to end the continuous appropriation within that program, and the legislation, not surprisingly, was vetoed by the governor. Employment development programs are also federally funded, and again, they have responsibilities to the federal government on what they do and how they do it. Department of Social Service programs are focused more on kids who are at risk of being placed in foster care, not exclusively anti-gang or anti-crime in their focus. Department of Alcohol and Drug Programs, they set aside about 20% of their funding specifically to target at-risk youth, such as foster care youth or youth who have guardians in substance abuse programs. Again, the focus being more on the substance abuse component rather than anti-gang or anti-violence. So those programs we will not be focusing on today for the reasons that I gave. With that, Ms. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think one thing that sort of struck me was how so many of these programs don't have any method for evaluating their efficacy. I mean, I think California's reluctance or inability or ambivalence, perhaps, toward implementing standards for evaluation is very scary and obviously not an acceptable way for us to have transparency and accountability for our taxpayer dollars. I mean, especially when we're considering right now this legislature is debating saving $300 or $400 million and releasing, tens of thousands of felons back out onto the street, to me, it is unacceptable for us to let dollars be wasted in any of our programs, and to make sure that they are all spent wisely. I mean, it's through the good work of this committee and the chair's leadership that we just passed a bill unanimously out of Assembly Business and Professions just yesterday that will help save the state millions of dollars, because we will no longer be requiring the use of or the completion of some irrelevant reports, and that's work that this committee did back in January. So looking forward to learning a little bit more today about what we can do here in order to save the state some money and be a little more accountable. So thank you.
Thank you. So with that, we'll bring up the first panel. Paul Sieve, Director of the Governor's Office of Gang and Youth Violence Policy, and Carol Delia, Deputy Director of the Little Hoover Commission. Paul, go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to be here this morning. As you said, I'm a Director of the Governor's Office of Gang and Youth Violence Policy, an office that was created by the legislature and the governor about a year and a half ago. And I want to thank the committee, first of all, for examining state programs that deal with gang and youth violence under the same standard that you look at many other kinds of programs, that is, efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability. And when we get past those words, I think the real issue is we're spending all this money, as you've mentioned, Mr. Chair. How do we increase public safety? That's what this is about, public safety, and how can we do it as efficiently and as effectively as possible? And I'd like to talk about the problem and what my office is doing, and really that is my office's mission, addressing that question from the perspective of gang and youth violence. So let me start by talking about what has been happening over the last few years and what doesn't work. Since 1981, there have been more than 15,000 gang-related homicides in the state of California. And I think that's the reality that hangs over this hearing and everything that my office does and everything that anyone does who's trying to deal with how do we reduce those numbers and start changing the quality of life for populations that are experiencing such high rates of violence and homicide. The statewide approach, this is now, it's a statewide problem. It used to be thought, and probably it was true for the most part, it was an LA or Southern California problem. But as we've looked at data over the most recent years, gang homicide has now, the phenomenon has grown from LA City, LA County, Southern California, to the rest of the state. And in fact, if we look at all of the counties outside of LA County, we looked at the data from 2005 to 2007, the number of gang-related homicides on that 3-year period actually increased. In LA, it stayed steady, a slight increase, slight decrease. But there's no doubt that it is spread. It is statewide, big cities, small cities, rural areas, suburban areas. And outside of LA, the numbers actually seem to be slightly on the increase. And that's while crime, as a general matter, is dropping. The strategy that the state has used up until recently has been principally suppression. And without going into all the reasons why suppression really is not the answer, any police chief that you talk to today or sheriff that you talk to today, everyone agrees we can't arrest our way out of the gang violence problem. We need suppression, we need enforcement, but alone is not going to eliminate this problem, as demonstrated by the fact that we have 15,000 homicides over this number of years. And so we need all of the tools at our disposal: prevention, intervention, and enforcement. That is now taken by all in enforcement, and outside of enforcement is we need it all. So what works? Or let me put it another way, what can work? The focus really has to be on the local level, the community level. It's people in the community, be it a city, a county, or however you want to define the local level. They're the ones who have the problem, and they're the ones who are going to ultimately have to deal with it and solve it. There are a number of things that they need to do, and a number of cities in California are doing this. I mean, they need to have a plan. Up until recently, people were just moving forward with the suppression approach, and they weren't trying to have a plan, which, anything you do, if you don't have a plan, how are you going to succeed? It has to be comprehensive. It has to be strategic. It has to be collaborative. I mean, everyone has to be involved. Law enforcement, city agencies, county agencies, faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, businesses, education. You name it. Everyone has a tool or a resource, and this is a long-standing and tractable problem that we have, and everyone has to be at the table. Everyone has something to add. As I mentioned, all tools, prevention, intervention, as well as suppression. And finally, and I'll get to this more later, to the extent that they can, local communities should be using practices or programs that have been demonstrated to work. I'm referring to evidence-based practices, and I do want to talk about that a little bit later. But from what I've said, what I've concluded, and what I hope to persuade you if you don't already believe it, is whatever the state does, the primary imperative here is what we do has to support and not get in the way of what the local community is doing. The local community understands their politics, their problems, their resources, what they have, what they can do. They understand it better than any of us will in Sacramento. So that is, I think, one key lesson that I've learned, and I'll get to a few other key lessons. What do we do at the state level? I mean, a lot of times when I talk to people in the community, they think that we're actually delivering programs, and of course, we're not. For the most part, what we are primarily doing is we're delivering money, local assistance, funding to the local level, be it the cities, counties, community-based organizations, and the like. So here are 4, I'm calling them first principles, that I think need to guide how we deliver local assistance. First of all, as I said, we need to do it in a way that supports what the local community is doing. Dictating from the state what the locals should be doing, I'm not sure that we know better, and it creates political issues and communication issues, and I don't think it's the best way to go. Second, as the chairman adverted in your description of funding streams, numbers, and so forth, there needs to be some type of mechanism to bring coherence and coordination to all these funding streams. What that mechanism looks like, I'm not sure at this point, but I think it's clear, as you said, that things could be improved. With the massive problem that we have, with its intractability, and with all the money that we're spending, having some mechanism to bring some coherence is absolutely necessary. And in fact, that's what we demand of the local communities, that they do exactly that. Third, the funding streams that come from the state have to be rational. And, what is rational? That's going to depend on the funding stream, the problem to be solved. It requires kind of an overall consideration of things. But for example, if we have 3 funding streams going from the same state agency to the same local agency, it's at least worth asking, would it be better to have those 3 funding streams from that agency simply consolidated into one? As a general rule, when you can simplify, it's better for everyone. It's better for the state. We can better track what we're actually spending and the outcomes or lack of outcomes. And from the local level, to have the money received in one pot rather than 3 pots gives them broader discretion to do, as I said, what the local level is best at doing, which is understanding their problems, defining it, and then deciding how to spend this money and other money that they get from sources other than the state. And finally, the first principle, as I call it, is we need to spend our money to get our maximum return. This is taxpayers' money that we are investing by giving it to local communities. And again, I'm talking about evidence-based practices. And again, I want to get into that in a little more detail, but if we are going to invest money, it helps the state, it helps the taxpayer, and helps local communities to, in some way, either through incentives or some other mechanism, to see that the money is being spent in programs that have been demonstrated to reduce recidivism, increase public safety. I mean, that's really what my mantra is. How can we increase public safety? Now, my office's mission is to implement these principles, in connection with gang and youth violence. So in the year and a half that we've been in existence, we've taken a number of steps along these lines, and let me describe them for you briefly. We've also put them out in our first year report to the legislature, describing what we did in our first year. The first thing we did, again, which the chair mentioned, is we did an inventory. Exactly how much money is the state spending in this area? And we looked at the areas of funding to the local level that deal directly with reducing violence, funding that deals with substance abuse, reduced substance abuse, which is a huge risk factor for violence, after school funding, which can be a great way to divert youth from spending those hours between 3 and 6, Monday through Friday, and out on the street committing delinquent acts or crime. And finally, job training. And I'm not going to be focusing on job training today, but I have to say, if I had to bet on something, I think job training and education are in some ways are the most important thing that the state can do in the long term to reduce this long-term intractable problem of gang and youth violence. We took an inventory by sending a survey to every state agency that we thought was involved. They gave us their numbers. We sent it back to make sure we got it right, and then we published it. And what we found was along the lines of what the chair reported. We had $1.5 billion. You said $1.3 billion. It's a lot of money, however you count it. Through 42 funding streams, 14 offices, in 8 departments. We also looked at programs or funding streams that we thought had great potential to reduce youth violence but weren't being used. And I'll just name Caltrans. Caltrans spends several $100 million, about $70 million every year on basic transportation enhancement projects, which are supposed to include the local conservation corps and the state conservation corps. That had not happened, even though that was the wish of federal authorizing legislation. The legislature and the governor last year, you enacted, the governor signed SB 286, and hopefully that is going to change. But there was a lot of money in Caltrans, for example, that could be, but wasn't being used to, I believe, reduce violence. And there we found, being conservative, $600 million last fiscal year, 9 funding streams through 5 offices and 4 departments. And so, I mean, those numbers, as the chair suggested, with so many funding streams coming from so many departments and so many offices, make the point that we can certainly do a better job by trying to bring some coordination, coherence. Let's align our goals. Let's find if there are gaps in funding, and there are some gaps in funding. Are there some funding streams that really are not getting much of a return for the investment? That is what we are now trying to do, having completed this first round of an inventory. And so our first step there is collaboration. That is the mechanism by which our office, with the support of the governor's office, is trying to bring coherence to all of these funding streams, through all these offices. We've convened a working group twice. One, the first time just to explain what our mission is, how we thought they could help us. We then did our survey. We convened a second time to discuss some of the funding streams, and we plan to meet again and again and again to really start trying to focus on how we can bring some more rationality and how we can promote evidence-based practices with all of this money that the state is investing at the local level. We are also looking at, as I mentioned, how can we rationalize funding streams? I'm not talking about taking money from one organization and moving it to another. I'm talking about, for example, as I mentioned, if you have 3 funding streams from one agency to another, perhaps they can be consolidated, perhaps some other benefits can be had. Simplification is always preferable to complexity when you're trying to understand basically what you're doing and what the outcomes are. Evidence-based practices, to me, this is in some ways maybe the biggest, or one of the biggest things that we're doing. In the last 10 years, through social science and other sciences, we have learned that there are programs and practices that actually do reduce recidivism or prevent crime. And the model that's used is the same one that we use in our protocols to test drugs. You have a control group, you have a treatment group. If the treatment group does better than the control group in a significant way, you have at least a pretty good idea that this is a program that reduces recidivism. In this case, recidivism being what we're measuring. And the more you can replicate it, the more certain you are. And so that is evidence-based practices. To me, is really what the state should be thinking about as it invests its money. Let's reduce recidivism in a way with the greatest likelihood possible that that's the result that we'll get. So what have we been doing in terms of promoting evidence-based practices? First of all, we've been working with a national expert, formerly from the RAND Corporation, and some of the other kind of highly respected folks in this field to come up with a list of programs and practices that actually do work. There are many lists out there. The U.S. Department of Justice has a list. There's a list called Blueprints, which is highly respected. There are a number of lists out there. Some are more respected than others. Using these experts, and I'm sorry to say we haven't completed the list yet, but we pretty soon will have completed this list of programs that we are pretty sure or very sure reduce recidivism as long as it's implemented, in the appropriate way. That list, I think, will be a great tool for state policymakers and for people at the local level to understand what works and also what doesn't work. Because we also know that there are some practices that simply do not reduce recidivism, or some programs that do not reduce recidivism. And that's as important as knowing what does work. Second, we have partnered with CSA. We put out an RFP, and in order to promote a particular evidence-based practice among probation departments called aggression replacement training, this was about $1 million RFP. That's in process. There will be trainers who will be in California who will train, I believe, approximately 26 probation departments in how to do this particular practice. ART reduces recidivism through evaluations. We know this by about 8%. And it's the cost-benefit analysis. The savings is about $23,000 per youth who participates in the program. So we've done that. Probation capacity. In terms of dealing with youth violence, if you can't prevent it, and it's going to happen, then I believe probation departments are the most important institution that we have in the state in terms of addressing youthful offenders, because they have the capacity, they have the mission to implement evidence-based practices. And in fact, there are a number of probation departments that are well on the road to doing that. Of course, there's a spectrum of where they are, but a number of them are leaders in the field, and they're moving forward. We've convened a working group there with chief probation officers to try to find out what their needs are. And what we don't have funding for this yet, but what we would like to do is set up some sort of probation evidence-based practice resource center. And by that I mean it would be a center, and the way I envision it, it would really be under the control, for the most part, of probation departments. I mean, they are the ones in the best position to know what they need, how best to go about doing things. The state should be a partner, but it should be a partnership between the state and probation in order to provide the technical assistance, data sharing, risk assessment tools. There are a lot of needs out there in order to be successful in implementing evidence-based practices, as well as, of course, following the outcomes to see if we're actually getting reductions in recidivism. My last point is just to talk about a grant that we've been giving out, and we've tried to apply these lessons to our grant. We have a CalGRIP grant. We give out approximately $9.2 million for the last 2 years. I believe we'll be doing it for a third year with CalEMA. The bulk of the money goes to cities, and some of it is going to CBOs. In the last round, we incentivized evidence-based practices. People who, cities or CBOs who applied and indicated they would implement an evidence-based practice got additional points. And there's a particular strategy which comes out of Boston, which reduces homicide and violence very quickly when it's implemented. It's been evaluated a lot. When I was U.S. Attorney in Sacramento, we did it in Stockton. It was very successful there. There we were able to raise $1 million from foundations to provide not cash to cities, but to provide technical assistance to cities that wanted to implement this strategy. And again, this was another incentive. A number of cities applied, and right now we're implementing this strategy in 5 cities, all of which have significant either homicide or aggravated assault gang-related problems. And what we're doing for our grantees who are not doing this, we call the Safe Community Partnership. We are now working with UCI to do some sort of, I'll call it at this point, an initial minimal evaluation for our new round of grantees on are there outcomes that can be measured and what are the outcomes to try to get a handle really on what all of our grantees are doing. In the next round of grants, we plan to do the same thing, try to start measuring the outcomes to see whether we're making good investments, bad investments, and really how can we improve on the investments, improve on the process. So, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my comments.
Thank you. We'll go to our second panelist, and then members can ask questions of both of them together. And we do have a quorum, so we'll go ahead and call the roll now.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, because I have to step out, I'm not on your committee, but I do have a bill very much related to this whole subject area dealing with evidence-based practices and streamlining. Wanted to say that I think Director Seif's been very open throughout his tenure in sharing information with the legislature. I know also Assemblymember Caballero has been very interested in these areas. Aside from the points you outlined, also from the oversight standpoint, imagine how many state staffers it takes to oversee if all these grant programs are going well, both in terms of just oversight as well as visiting these sites. So I think there's much to be done in this area. I'll have to leave, but I do have staff in the audience that will continue to monitor this hearing to see what else I might be able to do through my bill or collaborate with you on other bills. So thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Please call the roll.
De La Torre,
Here.
Strickland, Rambula, Berryhill, Block, Buchanan, Caballero, Emerson, Fletcher, Fuentes, Hagman, Huber, Jeffries, Jones, Krikorian, Perez, Valines.
Okay. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Carol D'Elia. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Little Hoover Commission. The Commission is a bipartisan panel charged with finding ways to improve economy and efficiency in government. I'd like to thank the Chair, the Vice Chair, and committee members for holding this important hearing today and for including the Commission as part of it. The Commission has 15 years of work in the area of juvenile justice, even longer in the area of public safety. I believe our mantra is similar to the mantra that Paul expressed. Public safety is the #1 goal when we're looking at this area, but we're also always looking for ways that the state can save money and serve clients better. I've been asked today, our work spans from the early 1990s, but there are 2 bodies of work that our commission did. The first in 2001, which culminated in a report called Never Too Early, Never Too Late to Improve Youth Crime and Violence, and a second report, which we did in 2008, which was titled Juvenile Justice Reform, Realigning Responsibilities. I've also been asked to specifically look at what the chair laid out, and that was how, with so many different programs spanning so many different departments, what is the effect of that on these programs and how the money is being spent. In our body of work, in both those 2 reports I mentioned, as well as in other work, one of the key things we found was that there was no single point of accountability, that the state simply doesn't have leadership. I think Paul, as well as the chair, laid out well how you have all of these programs spanning all of these different departments, but there's never been one single point for juvenile justice where people can go to. There's a lot of programs that are undoubtedly doing a great job, but there isn't, as the vice chair said, there's no accountability. Nobody's tracking how well are they performing. There's numerous entities with this role, but there's no one single entity that's accountable. We spend a lot of money on these programs, and yet we're not sure how they're working. We have bureaucracies that overlap. We have programs that may or may not be effective, and some that may even be counterproductive to the goal, which is reducing youth crime and violence. When we spend money, we're also on programs that aren't effective, we're missing opportunities to invest in those that are working. In our 2001 report, we specifically were looking at prevention programs. We're looking at the front end of the continuum. And what we found there was promising. There's a lot of cost-effective programs that are proven effective at preventing youth crime and violence. We also found that the state was investing substantial resources, but yet we found that the state had lacked the ability to pull these into a coherent statewide strategy for addressing both violence prevention and juvenile justice. We don't have defined goals, we lack the management infrastructure, and we don't know whether the resources are spent in the best way possible. We have no way of knowing what's working, how much we're spending, and which programs are not working. As Paul suggested, the Commission also found, and I think it's well known, that most of prevention and juvenile justice happens at the local level. The state has the role of providing the funding, but most of the hard work is done at the local level. So you can't do anything effectively without having an active partnership with clearly probation and other local law enforcement, but also the other players, whether it be schools, public health, mental health, alcohol and drug programs, the parents, the youth themselves. It's all a partnership. As Paul indicated in his testimony and the chair indicated, we have 42-something different programs that are strewn about all different sorts of entities. In addition to our 2001 work, I also wanted to tie in some work that we did in 2003. Some of you may remember the Office of Criminal Justice Planning. We did a quick look at that entity, and it had come up multiple times as we looked at youth crime prevention programs, as we looked at alcohol and drug programs, that entity simply wasn't functioning. The legislature at that point in time was no longer giving OCJP the grants. For example, the JJCPA, the Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act grant, went to what was then the Board of Corrections. So there started to be this disbursement. Our commission recommended eliminating OCJP, and that eventually happened. What happened next was we also said that those grants should be dispersed strategically. Some of them went to OES, which is now CalEMA. Some of them went to Board of Corrections, which is now CSA. Others went other places. Some of those that went to OES, we were working with Department of Finance at the time and said, we need to follow up on this and see, do these make the most sense? That hasn't happened. And so why I bring this up and add to it is there really isn't necessarily a rhyme or reason. There's no rationale behind where some of these grants are located. As we know, Board of Corrections morphed into the Correction Standards Authority. Again, our commission has a role in a reorganization. Whenever the governor wants to reorganize something, it goes through the Little Hoover Commission. Well, in 2005, we participated in the assessment of what would become the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And as part of that, the Board of Corrections got rolled into CDCR and became the CSA and took the juvenile grants with it. So I bring this up just to kind of lay the foundation that where the grants are now is not, somebody needs to sift through and figure out where do they belong, what makes the most sense. And it's an evolution over time. I want to touch a little bit on the recommendations that we made in 2001. Some of them have come to pass. The key was making prevention a priority and streamlining and integrating the funding for prevention programs. Forming a community-focused youth violence prevention coordinating council. That council took key players at the state level and would have matched them with local players that would have formed the ability to move forward. We recommended appointing a secretary for youth development and violence prevention that would have the authority and responsibility to advance a community-focused youth crime and violence prevention strategy. The Governor's Office of Gang and Youth Violence Policy has the opportunity to fulfill this role. We saw the creation of that as the beginning of a consolidation of the crime prevention programs for youth. I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about our 2008 report. It's a little bit different in that we were focused, instead of on the front end, we were focused on the back end. And the reasoning behind that report came from two different places. It came from our work in 2005 on the reorganization, When that was brought before the commission, the loudest cries were from advocates from youth who said that putting CYA underneath the CDCR umbrella was a mistake. Our commission was kind of on the fence about whether to recommend that that plan go forward, and what it eventually said was there was enough positive in the plan to go forward, but that we were going to keep track of what happened to the youth that were left as part of the CDCR system. The other part of that report was looking at the 2007 realignment legislation, SB 81, in which the legislature shifted the responsibility for all but the most serious offenders from the state facilities to local control, and the funding to go with that. So it was twofold. We were looking at the shift in realignment. We were looking at the youth that were left in the state facilities. And as a result, we were focused on that very farthest end of the continuum, those 100,000 youth that are in custody or under supervision at the local or state level on any given day in California. What we found, once again, was the same thing, that there wasn't any central point of contact. You had DJJ with some responsibility. You had CSA with some responsibility. You had Department of Justice with some data. You had a unit within, at the time, Department of Justice that I think has since been abolished that looked at prevention. You had the gang stuff that was in OES. Again, you just had no central point of leadership. So the theme for us was always, how do we centralize this? How do we stop the fragmentation? In that report, we also looked somewhat, but not in minute detail, but we looked at the 3 grant programs that the CSA has: the Youthful Offender Block Grant, the Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act, and the Juvenile Probation and Camps Program. We came to pretty much the same conclusion that Paul said, that we have 3 grants. They serve a similar population. They want to achieve similar results. Why do we need 3? Why can't they be combined into one and streamlined? And I'm sure others who come behind me can maybe speak to some of the specifics, some hurdles that maybe need to overcome. But the bottom line is we saw an opportunity to reduce bureaucracy at the state level and also improve for the locals who have to deal with 3 different funding streams instead of 1. Ultimately, in that report, our commission recommended establishing a Governor's Office of Juvenile Justice. It's not usual for our commission to recommend new bureaucracy, but it was frustrated and it was somewhat on the fence as to what to do. It felt that what was going on with both DJJ and CSA underneath the umbrella of CDCR, it was not able to really focus on youth. The focus there is on adult incarceration. And we felt that until it was brought out of there would never be a focus on the youth. So we were looking for a youth-centric entity at the time one really didn't exist. So we recommended establishing an office and pulling the grants from CSA. The vision that the commission saw was that this entity would fill the leadership void by assisting and guiding counties in expanding evidence-based programs, providing research and analysis on best practices, and acting as a clearinghouse for information. Finally, I've been asked to also address evidence-based programs. We looked at this a little bit in our 2008 report, and I concur with what Paul said, that there's a lot of information out there. He referenced some, blueprints and other work that's been done. We looked to Washington State. The Washington Institute of Public Policy has an outfit that really goes in and assesses the effect of a variety of programs nationwide. And you can go to their website, you can pull up documents. They're very specific. They have what works, how much they save by investing in these programs. They also show programs that don't work. And what Washington did, the Washington legislature back in the late 90s embarked similarly in trying to bolster local corrections. And they set up a program whereby their local juvenile courts would have a block grant of money as long as they selected from a list of state-adopted evidence-based practices. So that may be something that our state wants to look at as it's moving forward in guiding how we can better focus on evidence-based practices. In summary, an Office of Juvenile Justice, as our commission recommended, or a similar independent entity could provide the leadership required to improve outcomes and ensure that by reducing fragmentation and centralizing the knowledge and the resources, that money is spent wisely in California. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions from members? Assemblymember of Alliance, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you. Excuse me. Just a general question. When you were talking about, the streamlining and there's the different block grants, there's a couple of programs, one specifically in Fresno, that receives one police officer for one of the grants in Fresno. If we streamline these into something else, does that money go away and we have to reapply? And that would be probably the same for everybody here. Or, in effect, you're saying let's manage it better, but all those monies and positions still exist.
The three programs that I'm talking about are the ones that are the Youthful Offender Block Grant,
Right.
the JJCPA, as well as the Camps and Probation Program. They all pretty much target probation, although the Youthful Offender Block Grant is technically distributed to the County Board of Supervisors, who then can put it into probation, mental health, or alcohol and drug programs. So there's some flexibility. And those are things you want to watch out for. You don't want to create something that doesn't have the good things that were part of the Youthful Offender Block Grant, but at the same time, they actually are given this money annually in a sort of block grant fashion as it is. So they're not necessarily, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm sure CSA can explain them better, but they're not constantly applying. It's pretty much granted in a block grant. A challenge we saw is sometimes this block grant, the way it was funded before, although I think you guys changed that in the February budget negotiations, every year it was on the block as something that was going to be cut. So the locals had no idea in advance what they were going to get. My understanding now is they get quarterly payments somewhat based on VLF. Still a problem because they still don't know what they're going to get. So I don't know that there couldn't be measures taken that would further streamline this and make it better for locals and also save money at the state level.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Assemblymember Hagman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to kind of give a little background. I've had the pleasure to work on some of these boards and committees for many years. I think I was the San Bernardino Youth Chairman for the local WIB for 7 years before coming up here to the State Assembly. And I want to just offer the members and our distinguished panel here some of the observations we had from something like this. For those who are not familiar with the Workforce Investment Board, that's a federal grant dollars for putting people to work, basically. And there was a full WIB board that handled everything, and then a subcategory for the youth. And the youth always had quite a bit of money in there because it's actually a lot cheaper to invest in the job training than it was to pay for those programs, just like you have listed in here. And some of the positives we could bring out of that system that's been changed over the last 2 decades and kind of work is you had a partnership. You have one board that was local enough to really recognize what locally was going on and what the needs of the local communities and county was. And he had private members on there as well to offset with the professionals that sat on there and did this job day in, day out. So the funding streams, and there are many of them, just like you have here, when that be for foster kids or be for disabilities or for different parts, you would have these different funding streams, but the function was always pretty much the same. And that was either prevent and to have our participants get back, integrated back into whatever normal the workplace would be. But they had different needs and different criteria based on the funding streams. But without that coordination is what we're trying to achieve here. They were very, kind of went off on their own. So you had multiple layers of bureaucracy, administration levels, and different counties and accountability for each program, which spent so much of the money on all that infrastructure that didn't make it down to the street. Now, you still needed all those partners to do the job. But when you can coordinate those efforts and put them together at the same time, the program became much more efficient. And just some highlights we had off there, and just some suggestions maybe for us on the state level, is you do have a series of monies that from previous legislatures and needs we have put into these fields, and you can see the pages and pages and pages you have of that when you mapped it all out, and they're all very worthy in their own right. But they also require their own infrastructure and support network and basically fund their own government programs and employees based underneath those to keep those things going, when at the same time some of that infrastructure can be shared with other programs to handle out. So what we could be looking at, Mr. Chair, is a system somewhat like that, where you have a board or commission that we're all volunteers, by the way, so no one got paid anything, that you had mandated partners. So we had EDD, we had several state agencies, local agencies that were mandated, as well as a private sector, which allowed to have that community input and oversight by the average citizen to say, hey, what is really the best way of doing it? It's not an economic tool. It's not what department of the county or state needs the more resources this time because it's been cut. It's really what is most effective, and that was always being looked at. Now, that's going to be different at one county or one region than the other based on their regional needs. So they established these boards, again, that didn't cost anything. Then they set that up as a tool that everything ran through. Now, everything else, we also only had 10% administration. So we didn't use all the money running this thing. It was all sent out in the field, and everything was RFQ or RFP, and it was different even within the county. We had different needs for the high desert than we did in the west end of San Bernardino County based on the population centers, the distance, and all the rest of it. So these are some of the things that we may be able to think about how we can help you do your department, where we're not taking all the local control up to the state and say we know what's best at the state level for everybody, because it's not true. It's all different throughout the state. But we're able to give some structure and some accountability, what you're looking for those monies being spent. And then what they also did is set benchmarks and goals. So you could be at this level, we want you to get to this level, and that's how we're going to see if you're successful this year or not. And we give out money. Now, those levels are going to be different, again, per areas, because we have different needs and such each way. So I think, we got to look at, and we did evidence-based. We did all these different things because we were actually accountable for our results on the local commission or the local board that was also politically accountable to the supervisors or to the state level to do this kind of programs. The goals are something else we could work on, Mr. Chair. We could say we want X amount decrease in recidivism, or we want this to go here and there. But you have the partners already getting the funds. So you have a lot of these departments and agencies that are experts in the field. They have been working this for many times. Just not what we found out is even in the same county, many of these departments never want to share their information or resources. So we had, and again, we were focused on workforce development, so we would have job developers in one section that were work for economic development, but it was like pulling teeth to get that information to go to the job placers. And we would have to have our own job developers do the same thing. So what we're trying to do is eliminate the duplication of process or the information. And by forcing them all to be in one place and to communicate and have those coordinated efforts, then you can actually start to share those resources, share this information, say, how can I partner up with you to serve more clients so they get the monies out to more programming. Well, I'm not necessarily for the package because, some of these things, they're very loosely written. What I'm saying is more of, instead of trying to get to the end goal, is to try to sit there and make the structure that we can focus on the structure and then come back with the recommendations on the goals later.
Thank you. Assemblymember Pettis? And on the recommendations, they are recommendations. They're meant. It's not legislation. It's not, narrowly specific. These are some things that there seems to be consensus on in terms of the literature and the analysis that has been done, not by us, but by other folks, the LAO and Little Hoover Commission specifically. Assemblymember Pettis.
Thank you, Chairman De La Torre. Appreciate this conversation. As well as thank you as well, Mr. Sieve and Mr. Laya, for being here and presenting today. For a period of years, I actually conducted myself in a way in which I emphasized the efforts of working with our at-risk youth. In other words, what that means is that for a period of years, I organized on behalf of education, not incarceration, books, not bars, schools, not jails, working with folks at the local level, nonprofit organizations, schools, stakeholders like you mentioned, Mr. Hagman, at different levels, and bringing them to the table to see how we can bring about evidence-based practices in our local communities. And so I have very technical questions I'm hoping that maybe you could help me out with. So what are the percentages of resources distributed to suppression, prevention, intervention, and enforcement, if you had to put a number on that?
Now, statewide, I couldn't do that. A lot of enforcement money is going to enforcement for lots of purposes, and we don't know which way it's going. I can tell you something that this doesn't directly answer your question.
But if you had, just real quick, if you had to put a percentage of dollars that are being allocated in these 4 different methods of anti-gang youth violence, what would those percentages be? If you put a number to that,
I would guess that enforcement is getting the predominance of the money.
About how much would you say?
I really don't know.
Would it be more than 50%, 75%, 30%?
You know, traditionally that was the main way that local communities in the state spent money, but I would really be, I don't know, but that has been our major emphasis until recently has been on enforcement, no question about it.
So if that's the case, is there a move then towards perhaps allocating resources towards prevention and intervention versus suppression and enforcement? Because I think you're right.
Yes.
In the period of years that I've done this work, most of the dollars that have been allocated have been towards suppression and enforcement, kind of dollars coming in at the end versus really investing dollars in the front.
Yes. Yes, I mean, I definitely believe, and I think the evidence is that there's a movement, and just to provide evidence for that in two ways. One is, as I mentioned at the beginning, talking with police chiefs, many of whom I've known for years and work with, their view has changed on how to deal with gang and youth violence. That you need enforcement, but by itself, that's not going to solve this problem. It's a long-term problem, and it needs prevention and intervention, job training, education, and the like. In the grant that we've given out for the last 2 years, this $9.2 million each year, cities and CBOs can apply. But focusing on cities, we were very curious on what cities were going to apply for, because the grant allowed them to apply to use the money for any purpose, prevention, intervention, suppression, as long as they could justify it. And a very small percentage of that money was applied for in the suppression area. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it was something like 12 or 15%. The cities were primarily interested, and the police forces were right in there with the cities. I mean, they work with the cities to focus more of this grant money on dealing with the gang and youth violence problem from an intervention and prevention perspective. So at least in this grant that we've given out for 2 years, we've seen a clear focus on prevention intervention.
Well, I can appreciate that, and I'm not here to advocate that we do not allocate resources towards enforcement. I think that's just as necessary as suppression and prevention and intervention. I think what I'm advocating for, though, is equity in the distribution of dollars, because what I've seen, at least in my time of doing this work for a period of years, is that most of the dollars do go towards suppression and enforcement, which ultimately, in my mind, leads to oppression and repression, rather than liberation of our youth, if we are really emphasizing and investing in them at a younger age so that they don't go that route. And so my other question is dealing with intervention specifically and the issue of mental health. I know that many times our youth that enter the juvenile justice system go unnoticed and do not receive the professional care that they need. I was wondering if there's been some work there, and what does that look like?
Well, I mean, there's been a huge, certainly, recognition by people in probation that mental health issues account for a lot of the kids that wind up in the criminal justice or the juvenile justice system. Where we are right now, it's hard to say. The budget problems have really hit probation really hard, and so I mean, I'm waiting to see when the dust settles. But our ability to provide these intervention services, which include mental health, a lot of the evidence-based practices that reduce recidivism also address mental health issues, because a lot of times that is what is at the heart of. That's the best mechanism to reduce recidivism. I don't know where with budget problems. I think we are seeing a reduction in the capacity to provide the services, and which is one reason I think Carol and I agree that, I mean, with less money, you even have to be more vigilant in looking at how you're spending the money, and let's make sure we're spending it in a smart way.
No, I would have to agree with you, and obviously it's been noted through research time and time again in different states that providing mental health care services to the youth while they are in the juvenile justice system and after they come out of the juvenile justice system, that it works. And not only for the child or the youth offender, but also it works even more so when the family is involved, because many times when a person of the family is incarcerated, the family itself many times is mentally incarcerated, although physically not being in the system, they are mentally incarcerated. And so I like to see some numbers when it comes to the allocation of resources with regards to these 4 methods, and then as well what our numbers look like when we talk about mental health services. And just one last question I'd like to just bring up. You brought up the work of our probation departments, which I agree, probation departments have done some great work. But I do question if they are truly the best entity to deploy and implement the programs in our local communities. Back in the city of Coachella, for example, in the Coachella Valley as well as Imperial County, even throughout the Central Valley when I was doing this work, we formed collaboratives. And I think Mr. Hagman had talked a little bit about this. In other words, collaboratives, coalitions that brought together folks from the school districts, folks from the nonprofit sector, folks from public safety, different policymakers at different levels of power that were decision makers. And what we did was bring about programs that helped us at the local level, whether it was working through our schools and bringing in officers into our schools to talk to the youth, or providing counseling services when students were outside of school, and especially those students that perhaps were not, or that were suspended or expelled from school. And so what I'm wondering is to what degree are our nonprofits, especially the nonprofits, which many times are the organizations that are closest to the ground in our communities, to what degree are our nonprofits and our community-based organizations involved with our probation department in implementing evidence-based programs?
I don't have a number for you on that. I can tell you again the experience of this grant program that we've given out for the past 2 years, which I think is typical of the way things work. And that is, cities applied and received, about $7 million of this grant, and about 35% of the money the cities turned around and gave to community-based organizations. Community-based organizations do a lot of the legwork at the local level. And when I say probation I think is very important, I don't mean to say that the other organizations are not important. And in fact, really, to take a step back, the city organization, making a plan, having it be comprehensive, and taking advantage of all of the organizations and all the tools and resources available is what I think has to happen. And in the grant that we've given out for the past 2 years, cities, for good reasons, have employed community-based organizations to provide a lot of the services. Cities don't, their workforce is limited. They don't always have the skills necessary, the right people. So for a lot of reasons, community-based organizations are receiving a significant portion of these funds to deal with gang and youth violence.
Can I add to that comment?
Sure, please.
Our commission strongly feels the same way that you do, that at the local level it has to be a collaborative effort between mental health, alcohol and drug programs, the schools, the parents, probation, law enforcement, that it is a partnership. And I think in the work that we did, we found that there were a lot of counties that were doing just that, and involving the community-based nonprofit organizations. The reason that we see this role at the state level, a smaller role, but yet an important one, is to help those counties that are not collaborating in that way to see what other counties are doing. And so we kind of think that's the role of the state, to be best practices, to make sure that this county over here looks at the model over there, to make sure that there's the collaboration, but then to kind of get out of the way and let that local level collaboration take hold.
I can appreciate that. And one thing that we did as well, take it a step further, is because obviously resources are limited, we worked with the foundation world, in which the California Endowment Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, for example, the California Wellness Foundation, would provide us grant dollars. The unfortunate part about that is those were soft dollars. They were not dollars that were sustained to keep the program ongoing for a period of years. And so that would be, I bring that up only because I think that's another entity that should be playing a role as to how we implement these programs on the ground. So anyways, you have a tough task, but I appreciate your work. And if at all in the future, please call upon my office because I'm very interested in this work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Assemblymember Caballero.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to commend both of the presenters today for their presentation. As the chair of the Assembly Select Committee on Youth Violence Prevention, we took a look at the Little Hoover report of 2001 and also came to much of the same conclusions that we need to, that basically it's local government's responsibility to deal with youth violence, and when they're unsuccessful and the youth get in trouble, and they get in a lot of trouble, then it becomes a state responsibility to incarcerate. And so I really think changing the model so that we can more actively look at what really works and do it from one location, one central location makes the most sense. So I think the approach is absolutely right. One of the footnotes I'd like to emphasize is that we really don't focus on prevention, true prevention, and have not created models that provide opportunities for all children to be successful. Early childhood education, literacy programs. So as we move forward, if we can more succinctly identify those things that really, we know, all the police chiefs have said, early childhood education makes a tremendous difference. And so given our budget, probably not likely that we're going to set up that system to make it happen. But if we don't keep it on the radar screen, it's likely never to happen. And we'll always be looking at the suppression part of it, which is necessary but doesn't get us where we want to go. And I want to second what they've said in terms of trying to organize things in one office where we can really look at whether the practices that are being used are based on good evidence and be able to distill out those programs that have been funded for many, many years that are really not achieving the results that we want to achieve. And I say that given that that I'm from Salinas and we've seen the highest uptake in youth violence that the community has ever seen in the history of our city. It is absolutely out of control, and if we don't have a statewide approach to this, we can't solve the problem because gangs move. They are moving into a prison system where it's a statewide prison system where they are manipulating and controlling other people on the street, and so we need a statewide approach to this, and it really is. It's organized crime at that level, and to expect a small blue-collar community to be able to deal with it all by themselves, it just doesn't work. And so I want to really applaud the efforts that they've made, and hopefully we can continue to work at how do we reform, reorganize the system at a time when we have to be more, I think, efficient with our dollars. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Lowenthal.
Sorry, I came in late, and let me know if I'm repeating what was already said. A couple things. One is my police chief in Long Beach recently said something that we know, which is that by fourth grade, when there are young people who are repeatedly absent and have a high truancy rate, that is the moment to capture them. And I don't know if you have any programs that do that. So that's my first question.
Well,
to the Little Hoover Commission, our look at both the prevention programs as well as down the end of the continuum is a little bit more of a higher level. I do think that there's a representative from the schools that's going to come after us that maybe could speak to that more specifically than I could.
Okay, I think that's a critical piece of it, and I'm sure Mr. Perez would agree with me on that truancy, those intermediate years, is going to lead to the more dangerous activities. And secondly, in Long Beach, we had a program funded by the state for a number of years before it was cut off because of funding. It was a juvenile crime prevention project, and it was what Mr. Perez also talked about. It was primary prevention. It was the best program, and it was a very expensive program, and it involved all of the families, the entire family constellation, along with the young people. It was incredibly successful and effective and had all kinds of evaluation measures, and I just want to say, funding, the lack of funding has really hurt us in that regard, because that was a demonstration project that could have been replicated to address some of the things that I've heard here today.
Well, to echo that, I think what we have seen, fortunately in juvenile crime prevention, there actually has been a significant amount of money invested. And kind of going back to Assemblymember Perez's question, our commission, we don't have the facts and figures on how much is being invested. But I think juvenile justice provides a really good model. If you look back in the mid-1990s, there were 10,000 youth incarcerated at state juvenile justice facilities. Today, there's about 1,600. And that's a result of policy choices that were made. And at the same time, youth crime and violence is down. There are pockets where it's not down, but overall youth crime is down in California, and I think you can attribute that to the money that simultaneously was invested in programs like the JJCPA. And so it clearly shows a model of how over time you can decrease money spent at the most expensive level, which is typically state incarceration, and move that money, particularly with youth, into prevention. So I think the model is there. I think it's right in front of us. And I think that the better that we can use those resources that we have, what this commission is talking about today, if we can eliminate programs that aren't effective and focus on those that are working, we'll be able to spend the public's money more wisely and get the outcomes we all want.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming before us. We will bring up the next panel. You might want to stick around in case during the questioning of the second panel, maybe they might have other questions of you. If we can have Kurt Wilson from the Correction Standards Authority, Brendan Murphy from California Emergency Management Agency, Chuck Nichols from Learning Support and Partnerships Division of Department of Education, John Malloy, Department of Education, Karen Pank, Chief Probation Officers of California, come forward. As is usually the case with this committee, the first panel always goes long. It's not the speakers necessarily, it's the members. So if you could be very brief, especially because there's 5 of you, and focus on your piece of this pie, we would greatly appreciate that. We'll start with Kurt.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Certainly, CSA welcomes the opportunity to share its perspective. We certainly hate to see the state reinvent the wheel, and we think we've got some insights that can help with this process. Obviously, we agree with you that the benefits of early prevention are evident. No matter how you track them, the benefits are there. As we look forward, we recognize that it's a very complex issue. So complex, in fact, that it's easily misunderstood. In looking at some of the recommendations, we're concerned that there was some misunderstanding about some portions of it, so we'd like to take this opportunity to address some of those as well. As you began, Mr. Chair, you mentioned that you were excluding certain pots of money, for example, from education because they were federally funded. And because the Correction Standards Authority also administers federal funds, I would also, with the same line of reasoning, request that those funds also be excluded from this conversation if that's acceptable.
Well, clarify to us which you are referring to.
Certainly. Well, you mentioned that you were excluding funds from the education side because they were funded by federal funds.
No, I understand that part of it. I'm saying which programs are you saying in Correction Standards Authority are federally funded that you think
certainly
need to be?
We fund those out of the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act and the Omnibus Crime Act. So we've got the Title II funds, the Title V funds, and the Juvenile Accountability Block Grant funds.
Are there outcome measurements that the federal government requires for those programs?
Yes, there are.
So you're doing what we want everybody to do.
Certainly. I just wanted to clarify because in one of the recommendations, it mentioned all state-administered funds and didn't give any respect to the source of the funds, so I wanted to make sure those weren't included in the recommendation.
Yes. Again, our goal here is anything that is state-funded or federally funded that has outcomes, that's all good. We're not trying to, again, reinvent the wheel. If there are outcomes attached to it, whether it's state or federal, that's great. Our problem is with the stuff that doesn't have any outcomes measurement attached to it, because then we don't know whether it's federal money or state money,
Certainly.
whether we're getting a good bang for our buck.
Certainly. And to clarify, also in the staff recommendation, it mentioned that the only CSA-funded program that has those outcome measurements is the Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act, which some of you may know as SHIF Cardenas. And while it's true that previously that had been the only one with the legislatively mandated outcome reporting requirement, it's not the only one that we've done. To the extent possible, where staff has had the resources and the flexibility within the way the statute was written, CSA staff has gone above and beyond to do exactly that. So, for example, in the the JPCF funds, the Juvenile Probation Camps funding, while it's not required by statute for CSA to track that measurement, because it was a large pot of money at one time, that is something that we did track. Unfortunately, because of the change in funding streams as a result of the February budget, we'll no longer be doing that because that portion is no longer rests with CSA. Also, in the list that's listed on here was the MIOCR money, the Mentally Ill Offender Crime Reduction Grant, which I believe some of the members were speaking about a little bit earlier. Once again, although it was not required in legislation, that is something where CSA staff did go ahead and require that of the grantees and collect that data. Ironically, that data showed some very strong evidence-based practices, and it certainly showed its worth. Unfortunately, that program was subsequently unfunded, so that program is no longer current for us within CSA. I'm trying to shorten my comments at your request, Mr. Chair. I apologize.
Mr. Wilson, as you're looking at your comments as you're going through, all those federal reporting requirements, do those get sent to the legislature as well? Do people review those?
They do not specifically get sent to the legislature. However, they are publicly available. They're on our website, and we'd be more than happy to share them with you.
It might be helpful.
Certainly.
As the chair said, we're looking for the outcomes.
Certainly. In fact, perhaps the most relevant will come in about 3 weeks. Last week we had our federal monitor out, who comes to monitor exactly how we're monitoring those, how we're administering those federal programs, and he gave us actually the most glowing report that we've ever seen when we did our exit interview late last week. So it'll take him up to 30 days to complete his report, but we're certainly anxious to see that report because it's got some wonderful recommendations, as did the Hayward Burns Institute in their national publication, which called California the CSA program a model for other states to follow. We've got several accolades that we'd be more than happy to share with you, including the outcome measures for those programs. One other thing I'd like to note from the earlier comments, there was obviously concern from several people about when the Board of Corrections became CSA and was lumped under the CDCR umbrella. And while we will agree that the original transition clearly had some issues, we would also like to report and acknowledge that more recently we have made significant strides to overcome those issues. So while there were challenges that were referred to by the earlier speaker's comments, we would like to make it clear that we've made tremendous progress even within being under the CDCR umbrella. And in the interest of time, that'll conclude my comment to this point.
Thank you. I'm sure members will feel free to have questions later on. Go ahead. Who's next? Brendan.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Brendan Murphy with the California Emergency Management Agency. And I would like to just go over a few of the programs we have. And I guess I'd take the first note, which is you'd mentioned earlier we have $11 million. If you take off the CalGRIP funding that we jointly administer with Director Sieve, then I think that takes our funding down to right around $2 million. So thanks for having me. And we'll quickly go over those programs. I don't want to waste any more time than is needed. So the Anti-Gang Initiative program is a federally funded program. It was in the federal fiscal year 2006 and 2007. Those are actually pass-through funds from the United States Attorney's Office. The U.S. Attorney's Office makes all of the recommendations and funding decisions on that. The next one is the CalGRIP program that we jointly administer with Director Sieve, and I won't go into detail since you've already heard about that. The next program was the Gang Violence Suppression Program, which is currently in the 910 adjusted budget, funded at about $1.5 million. And in that, I think that we're already working towards a collaboration process with Director Sieve to meld this program in with some of the CalGRIP programs. We've already jointly funded a few probation issues along the way that happen. Right now in statute, there's some very specific allowability issues with this program that we need to change first before there's a blending of the two, a complete blend. Then we have the Fresno Multi-Agency Gang Enforcement Consortium, which actually has my favorite acronym, which is MAGIC. The MAGIC program focuses on identifying, apprehending, and prosecuting.
Fresno's where the magic happens?
Fresno is where the magic happens, apparently. And I actually believe this is the program that Assemblymember Lyons was referring to earlier. This is $83,000 in Local Safety and Protection Act funds, and it does fund an officer there in Fresno. The Project Safe Neighborhoods program is a federally funded program that combines state and federal efforts for law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and community-based organizations to reduce gang violence and gun crime through intervention as well as education strategies, enforcement, and vigorous prosecution. It's kind of the vertical prosecution style in there. And so in 910, that's about $890,000. Apparently, we've gotten very specific. I was waiting for the decimal point. And then the final couple programs here. The Regional Anti-Gang Intelligence-Led Policing Program is a program that was originally funded out of the Bureau of Justice Assistance grants. That's used for targeting violent crime initiative intelligence-led policing programs. So it was really established as to have regional anti-gang coordinators in each of the 7 law enforcement mutual aid regions in California. And the goal was to start to make sure that that all of the gang law enforcement programs were also coordinating with the community-based organizations. So I think the program so far has really only had about 2 years to really get off the ground and get its feet in the hold. We have funded this program out of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds through the Justice Grant at $2.1 million. And I think that's one of the coordination programs that many of you were talking about earlier, where it gives somebody with a law enforcement background and a perspective, but yet in a role that is a very civil service-oriented role to make sure that the proper liaison is happening between all the affected parties in these communities. A spinoff from the Project Safe Neighborhoods, which was the federal grant I mentioned earlier, was the 6-City Anti-Gang Initiative Program. This was 1 year of funding for this program was awarded through the U.S. Attorney's Office again and allocated through the U.S. Attorney's Office. Cal EMA only acts as the fiduciary agent, so to speak, for them. And the final one was the Cal Gang Database, and this wasn't mentioned in the letter of invitation, but I did want to throw it out there, in that this is and administered by the California Department of Justice through 6 regional nodes. It is a database tracking information on the 5,914 identified gangs in the state. So yes, it is very much a law enforcement-oriented tool, but I just wanted to throw it out there that we do support that, and it gets about $260,000 a year.
Thank you. Chuck?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Chuck Nichols of Learning Support and Partnerships Division of the California Department of Education. We have a Safe and Healthy Kids Program Office, which administers 3 different violence prevention programs. All of these programs have been affected in major ways or are expected to be in the last few months because of budget-related legislation. I'll speak to that briefly, but first I'll describe them a little bit. The first program is the School Community Violence Prevention Grant Program. It awards $14 million a year in $500,000 grants that are spread over a 5-year period. Typically, we get about 150 grant applicants and fund 30-some programs. Our administration of this program is based upon our requirement that evidence-based programs be used. Nobody gets funded unless they've described an evidence-based program they intend to use. And part of their operation of the program, they must survey students, collect outcome data, write an annual self-evaluation. We review those self-evaluations, the data, the expenditure reports, and provide technical assistance based on what we learn, or sometimes we require corrective action. But that's how the program operated up until February this year. In February is when the flexibility legislation for education's categorical programs was enacted, which means that most of education's categorical programs, including this one, the funding may be used now for any educational purpose, and they don't necessarily have to follow the requirements of this grant program any longer. However, many of the programs still are operating, and we are still providing them with technical assistance and support. Also, programs that were funded before 2008-9 are still operating under the requirements that they had to meet when they applied for the funding. Our second state-funded school safety program is the $80 million per year school safety block grant. This program was created after the shootings in Columbine, Colorado in 1999. The funds go out to all LEAs based on an enrollment formula and may be used for anything that a local education agency determines will materially affect school safety. The legislature deliberately at the time said they just wanted this money to be under local control, and they did not fund the department to monitor the program or establish accountability standards or anything like that. So we simply put the money out according to the formula. We post guidance on the web about what we think what is the legal way to use the money and what we think is good ways to use the money. We answer questions from the field, and when we happen to learn of incorrect uses of the funds, then we require correction. But as with the previous program, beginning February, this program also went into flexibility, so these funds may now also be used for any educational purpose. We believe that 4 years from now, when the flexibility legislation expires, it would add a lot of effectiveness to this program if some accountability measures were included in it. Our third and last program that the Safe and Healthy Kids Office administers is a federal Safe and Drug-Free Schools and Communities program. Although this money is federal, it is it's kind of a model in the requirement for use of what that program calls science-based programs. We collect outcome data, require annual reports on what kind of programs have been operated, and use that information to identify LEAs that may need assistance and support for us. Unfortunately, this program is a very good chance of expiring after this fiscal year. Neither House of Congress has any money for this program in the federal budget at the moment. So I guess that's a very brief introduction to those three programs. I'm, of course, able to provide more detail if you need it. Thank you.
John.
Chairman, my name is John Malloy. I'm with the After School Programs Office of the Department of Education. We administer two programs, which you mentioned earlier, the 21st Century Community Learning Center, which is funded under Title 4B of the NCLB, No Child Left Behind Act, and also the ACES program, which is funded at $550 million a year. It was approved by voters through Proposition 49. Currently, we serve, we have programs in more than 4,000 schools across California, elementary, middle, and high schools. By far and away, most of them are public schools, although because we have a federally funded grant, we do fund some private and parochial schools through the federally funded grant. Proposition 49 triggered and had a triggering when it passed by the voters in 2002. It didn't start immediately until the state budget reached a certain point that it could trigger. It triggered in 2006, in the 2006-7 school year, and Senate Bill 638 amended the Ed Code and placed certain accountability measures in for Proposition 49. Because of Section 84.75 of the Ed Code, all those accountability measures also apply to the 21st Century Grant, which, in addition to the state measures, accountability measures, has its own federal accountability measures. So it's those people are the people who have 21st Century Grants are responsible for two separate accountability measures, which are very similar, but they report to both the feds and to us. Section 84 of the Ed Code makes it clear that it says talks about the accountability measures, the attendance, not only of attendance in the after-school program, but attendance in the regular day school program. We've found that those students who regularly attend the after-school program are far more likely to attend regular day school at an increased rate. Academic achievement is mandated. Homework completion, behavior, and skill development. All of those are reported by the individual grantees annually to us and reviewed. In addition, Section 83.55 of the Ed Code mandated an independent evaluation of both the 21st Century Program and the ACES program. We worked with the Advisory Committee for Before and After School Programs to develop an evaluation outline for those programs. It was approved by the State Board of Education, and we contracted with the UCLA Crest Center for this evaluation. The UCLA Crest Center has done numerous evaluations of after-school programs in California and across the nation. And following the requirements of Education Code, this report will be provided to the legislature and to the governor at the end of 2011. Of course, working with children and evaluating the results of children is not like, as someone mentioned earlier, evaluating widgets. It's a complex subject and something that will be worked on and studied from many different viewpoints. Finally, with the triggering of Prop 49, the ACES program became part of the State Controller's audit guide, so that every year local school districts and city and county governments who run ACES programs, as part of their single audit, have all the requirements of the ACES program audited by their independent audit. Any other questions? Be happy.
Thank you. Karen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members, for inviting us here today. My name is Karen Pank. I'm the Executive Director of the Chief Probation Officers of California. And while we don't administer any of these programs you've been talking about today, we are the recipient of many of them. And since we actually control 99% of the juvenile justice population, I'll try to keep my comments brief, but if we're going to divide it up by that, maybe I could make a pitch for a few extra moments along those lines. The mission of probation is very diverse. It's very large, and I think that's why sometimes when, especially your earlier panel was discussing, the need to consolidate, that some things get lost in that discussion. Specifically, I'll address just three of the main juvenile justice funding streams that we receive from the state. They flow through CSA, and those are the Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act, JPCF, the Juvenile Probation Camp Funding, and then YOBG, the Youthful Offender Block Grant. And the reason I point to those is because there's been a lot of discussion both in this committee today and over the years about potentially consolidating. And I think you got to ask, why should we? What are we trying to gain? And some of the things that we've heard here today and have heard before is that you want to try to increase accountability. You want to ensure that we know what these funds are going for. The problem with looking at these three funds as one block grant, for example, is that they all go for one of those diverse missions that probation serves. For example, JJCPA is mainly to do intervention and prevention. We have reporting requirements, In fact, there was a legislative discussion a couple of years ago about releasing us from those reporting requirements because probation actually, I would argue, has to fulfill more reporting requirements than almost any local agency for any state funds. And so we actually turned that offer down. Part of the reason was as we were starting to get into some severe cuts in the state budget situation, the thought was, well, maybe if we release some of the reporting requirements, you can use this for services and you don't have to cut back as much, which it was very appreciated. But one of the policy decisions that our group made was much of what you're talking about today. We need to be able to defend where we're using these funds and what we're doing with these funds. So we continue to report on those through CSA. The camp funding, the JPCF, is about detention. It's about camps. And that's a completely different mission than your intervention and prevention funding. Again, we do report on how we're using those funds. And then the Youthful Offender Block Grant is all about the realignment that took place a couple of years ago of otherwise state juvenile offenders that were treated at DJJ. There was a policy decision made that since we are handling 99% of the juvenile population, which we would argue fairly successfully, if you look at across the board, the state juvenile crime rates going down, the number of kids that we have incarcerated both at the state and local level down, the thought was there would be a small population that we could shift to the locals, but would do so with state funding. So to try to consolidate very different programs might not accomplish the accountability that you strive for. And in fact, I would think it would remove some of the accountability because it would be very difficult to pick a report that would address all of those things. That's not to say that the chiefs wouldn't like to have less ties around their arms, for state funds. It does become a little bureaucratic, but those are just three examples. They're large examples of where we get our funding, and so we would just make those points that we're not sure that those would be good candidates to do that. The second piece that has been talked a lot about today, which is kind of where we get the funding, where does the funding flow through? And, we would point out that we've been working with CSA, formerly Board of Corrections, for over 15 years in what I would put up as a model for the state to look at how to manage a state-local partnership. As I mentioned, we handle most of the juvenile justice population. And we actually take exception to some of the comments earlier where it was said there's no leadership in this area. We submit that our chiefs do serve as leaders in the juvenile justice arena, and we're able to do so by CSA providing a forum through their executive steering committees. We think that all agencies should be looking at those types of things because there has to be a recognition that the state has a role of making sure we're using these funds appropriately, that there's some statewide, coordination and flow as to how those funds are used. But as we all know, the 58 counties are very different. Their needs are different. What they're able to provide are different. And so we've found kind of that soft spot where you can have the state provide the forum for the leadership to bubble to the top. And we would argue that that's happened at least in those arenas. You're talking about a lot of various different funding sources, many of which don't even come to probation, and we can talk about that on another day. But that those I can't speak to if there could be improvements in that area. But as it relates to that, I strongly believe we're on a good path, and we might be looking for a solution to a problem that doesn't exist in that piece of the pie. We would also, what can be done? I mean, I know this is what this committee is looking at, and where can we make some changes to improve state outcomes and improve our local communities. And certainly we'd be happy to sit down and work with this committee and other members in looking at those types of things. But if I could offer one thing that is something we've been working on locally, and again, this doesn't affect all of the different pieces you're talking about, but CSA is, after the reorg a couple of years ago under CDCR, we ran a bill, and it's now a 2-year bill, SB 441, to put back into place the Board of Corrections situation that we had prior to that, which we think would just further strengthen that state-local partnership that we think we've been able to accomplish prior. The other thing that had been suggested, and this may be a way to sweep in some of these other programs that you're talking about today and have some consolidation, some statewide leadership, is kind of this clearinghouse option that I think Paul Sieve was talking about, and that is, we strongly believe there could be technical assistance. There could be one place that the state could provide what other states are doing. What is the latest in evidence-based practices? I mean, we're implementing evidence-based practices in probation now. That said, every county has differing levels of ability to get from A to B, and having a state that might be able, not in the regulatory fashion, because again, they only have 1% of the juvenile population, but more in an assistance and research and clearinghouse information model, which other states have, such as Washington State, which is often looked at as a model in the juvenile justice and criminal justice area. We would be supportive of something like that and think that there's some need there. So with that, I'll conclude my comments and leave some time for questions.
Assemblymember Huber.
Thank you. I'm actually interested, Karen, in your comment that you think that we're kind of trying to propose a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. And you can see from the chair's opening remarks, we're looking at multiple different funding sources, and I get that each of those funding sources started out for a particular reason. But is it your opinion that you can't consolidate those because there's no way you can come up with a model to ensure that you're addressing all the different pieces of this? I mean, I get that suppression is different than intervention and prevention, but is it your opinion then that you couldn't do that under one block grant?
Only for those 3 block grants that I specifically addressed, because those are ones that come to and are administered by probation. Some of these others, I don't have any expertise in being able to tell you if that can happen. And the reason being that those 3, it's not just that they started out, and that is true about, I know just some block grants, they say, well, for example, Columbine, we need to do something for school safety. Well, are we at a different place now? I don't know. We don't receive that block grant. But the JJCPA is for kids who, before they get into our system. And just because probation handles those kids as well as the ones who are now being detained, which is the other block grant, those are 2 very different purposes and used in different ways. We do report to CSA on both of those as well as YOBG. So is there, some more things that you would want to do on each of those? Yes. Do you accomplish say state savings by consolidating those 3? We would argue no. Are there other ones that we could look at and talk about? We just don't have the expertise on those.
Assemblymember Lowenthal.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for for your reports and your commitment to programs that help our young people and divert them from the system. And your passion for what you do. And I guess what I'm feeling as I listen to you and not fully understanding the specifics, even after you've reported them, is it's our job to better understand the accountability, where the money goes, what we're getting back for our money. It's also important to understand that we have a crisis of confidence in the state, and that we are lacking, the public is lacking an understanding of what it is we're doing. So I'm wondering about the technology piece of all this. And even if, in fact, you have separate programs that you believe would be more effective to keep separately, are you communicating with each other? Do you have software that communicates with each other? Do you have websites that allow the public, the person sitting at home, to navigate between the different divisions that make up youth crime prevention? So that's kind of what I'm looking for, not the individual accountability, but the technology piece that would allow the person in any part of California to better understand what it is that you're all doing.
And I can only answer for CSA, but I would say the answer to your question is yes, we do use technology in that way. But even beyond technology, the communication we have, for example, with the chief probation officers, because they are the recipient of a large amount of the funds that we do distribute from CSA, we're in constant communication with them. So that's not unusual. But even with the other state agencies, for example, this isn't the first time that Brendan and I have had a conversation about grants together, because we do have that part. But I do want to be clear about the accountability portion that you mentioned there, and I want to dispel any myth that we're allocating funds without holding people accountable for them, and we use that for the large grants as well as small grants.
But let me interrupt you for a moment, if I could. And what is it any member of the public can see? How can they get to that piece that you're describing here? But how could they know about that?
Certainly, they can go to our website, and from there they can find all the documents that we produce, as well as even the RFPs that when we are going to allocate a new stream of funding, we go through an executive steering committee process, which is essentially a public meeting in where we bring in a bunch of subject matter experts along with our research staff who train them on specific research components for the RFP to draft the RFP. When it comes back, it goes through a rating process, which, again, is available to the public on our website. So the outcomes as well as the process are all available to the public on our website.
And is the formatting identical for each and every component of the system?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you going to do it the same way? With the other agencies?
Exactly. I mean, it's a real challenge if you each do it differently and evaluate it differently and have different evaluation measures and so on, to go from one to the other and kind of readjust, well, how do I tell how well they're doing in this department as opposed to that department? So that's just something I wanted to throw out there. I'm not sure you can all answer that question now, but it's...
Well, the answer in our cases would be no, because we don't use, it's not consistent, kind of a cookie-cutter approach to the different funding streams. They're catered to the intent and the restrictions for that particular funding stream. We just did with Proud Parenting, for example. We've now revamped that, and we partnered with Pepperdine University to come up with some parameters for measurements that are based specifically on what that entails, which would be very different from the JJCPA or from any of the other portions that we administer.
Well, to the extent that we as a state are the granting agency as opposed to the federal government, the more consistent we can be, I think the more sense it'll make to the public in their homes.
So, I mean, to build on what, I guess, kind of what Kurt was saying, from the California Emergency Management Agency, we do, every year we have a report to the JLBC, to the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, that details out all of the grants that we do on our public safety and victim services side. And to that extent that you said, I think that we have the kind of generally the same problem that Kurt has, is we're looking at, we're looking all across, many grants and funding streams that aren't even included in today's hearing, and we put them into one report. So yeah, there are going to be different areas and different considerations as to how you enumerate those. I'm sorry, I can't see over my shoulder. And so it's not going to be like that kind of perfect cookie cutter approach. Kind of can't happen. But we do have for each grant program very specific characteristics and accountability measures that are already built in.
I would also add that the Department of Education has a website that has several times received national awards for its design. In the school safety area, it contains suspension, expulsion, and truancy information. Plus, we use the website to post science-based programs lists. I mentioned earlier that we described the legal use of the block grant funding. This is not to say that we couldn't improve on getting out to the general public, but we do make a serious effort to post, important information, and we do a pretty good job of what we do. I think the use of technology to communicate with the general public is something that's really developing fast, and who knows, everything may be on Twitter by next year, But we do. That's right. That'd be a tough one, I guess. But we do work on it, but I'm quite sure we're not consistent with other state agencies.
Thank you.
if I can just add that many of our evaluation requirements are specified specifically in education code. So those are the ones that we, it would be certainly different than what we would look for from probation areas. But as far as technology, we also use a fairly old-fashioned one. I meet weekly with the managers of the office that controls the state attendance review board areas. We meet weekly with our people in the health and the education department who work on school community violence. We meet weekly with our health people, so that we make sure that after-school programs are fully integrated and everything else is going on specifically in these areas.
Thank you. Assemblymember Vines.
Thanks. I was just a couple of general comments, and I think Mrs. Pink makes a great argument for why these three programs are unique and have to be treated. I don't know if special is the right word, but I get it, because it's hard to put them all into one. But it also then sort of illustrates the problem where I think the chair and the vice chair are trying to guide the conversation, which is one thing we don't do well in the legislature is make priorities. And it's come up a lot in the discussion about certain budget decisions that were made, and so it's impacted things. We don't, as a legislature, make priorities. We just sort of fund everything and do the best that we can. And when we get hit like this, we take money back, and so it's affected everyone. I think what we're trying to do is find a way, and I don't think people go to websites to look around, by the way. I think it's important, and everything you're doing, I hear you. You're really doing your best as a public servant to put the information out there. People don't have time to go look at that, nor do they know where to go and look. So what they're looking for is the legislature and you as partners to find a way to, frankly, prioritize all these programs and find out which ones are working, which ones aren't, what's the best way to categorize. I think in some general, I don't know all the terms, that you were using, but, there's the prevention, there's punishment right through the list. And how do you fund those? I'm a big believer and always have been that, I would pile so much more money that goes into criminal justice issues and prison issues into early intervention reading. I'm a big believer. Put it all into reading. If we get every kid reading before third grade, statistically, they're not going to have those problems. So that's where I think we're trying to get to. We would need your help to say all of them are relevant, but all of them have to be put into some broad categories that we can have information on. I was looking through the list the other day last night when it was given to us of all the different programs. We get paid to go through and look at this information. We have no idea. And I would suspect that outside of your departments that you're in, you don't know what everyone else is doing either. And there's got to be a better way to communicate that. And this is just a big symptom of government in general, where we're not making priorities. And we haven't done that. And so that really illustrates itself when the budget crisis comes, which is about, every 4 years now, or 4 months apparently in California, that then it affects everyone. So I like where the discussion is trying to go about putting in some broad categories. How do you fund them? What's the most important? They're all relevant. But what is the critical need that you would fund? And then if you have extra money, here are the other things we could do. And that's where I think we're trying to get to, because just looking at the list shows you it's completely unmanageable. We don't know where the money goes, and we don't know what the outcomes are. I didn't realize that you guys have outcomes on the federal issues, right? We just it's not our money, we don't care, but we should, because there could be some crossover. So I like where the discussion's going. I hope we can get to where we are trying to put everything on the table, make those priorities, do some broad categories, and then make decisions legislatively. I think it would make sense.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, just a comment on that. That's similar to this clearinghouse concept that I was mentioning earlier. And if you look at what Washington State does, their Public Policy Institute, they actually not just looking at the stream of funding, but you look at the program, and they almost do an ROI, a return on investment for that program, so that when, for example, probation says, all right, now I have my JJCPA money, it's this amount, I know what I have to report on and what the state's expectations are. What is the best evidence-based program going right now to address the type of problem I have? And that would be a real use in the state that I don't think exists currently in California.
Thank you. We'll get to a discussion of the recommendations and how we want to proceed. But first, I want to open it up to any public comment at this time. Anybody from the public wishing to speak on today's discussion?
Thank you very much. My name is Sandra McBrayer, and I am here wearing two different hats. One is I am the chair of the State Advisory for California for the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention And I also chair for the Governor of California the After School Advisory, which you heard from John Malloy on both before and after school with both state and federal funding. I would like to add some clarification and some better understanding to some of the comments that were here and some of the documents that you received so that we have understanding. One is, as you know, every state in the nation is required to have a state advisory on juvenile justice delinquency and prevention by the federal government. In order to receive federal dollars, which is our Title II, our Title V, our Juvenile Accountability Block Grant, we have to have a committee. And I want to assure you that our committee is made up of both those in the field of professionals from probation chiefs to DAs, but it's in fact required that 50%, more than 50% of that committee must come from the community. And in fact, in our state, we meet that requirement, and we also meet that requirement with youth representation. So we do have community-based organizations at the table, we do have practitioners in the field, and we have youth who've been in the system who are at our table in our design of our programs to ensure that input from across the state is heard. I also want to ensure that our committee does, in fact, look at and support a comprehensive approach. When we look at releasing all of our funds, as you heard earlier, we focus on prevention, intervention, and suppression. So as you heard that the majority of dollars are going to suppression, I would actually counter that, because when you heard the initial presentation of the $1.3 billion, the majority of those dollars were in fact in education, which actually will show you that that is early prevention and intervention, not suppression. So while some of the law enforcement dollars have historically gone to suppression, the majority of it is in fact on prevention programs. I also want to ensure that as we provide oversight, that we in fact do remember where you were asking, do we partner and consolidate? We actually, through all of our federal dollars, match our state dollars. So we look at what is the state, what are county probations doing, and how do we add value with our federal dollars. So we don't, in fact, try to do two different things. We try to merge to say what are counties seeing and what are their issues, and how do we support that. And in fact, we do meet the federal requirement, which I want to caution as I get to my final remarks, is we do support evidence-based practices, but we also meet the federal mandate to also support promising practices, which calls out in OJJDP. They talk about making sure that we continue to fund promising practices, which is the pipeline to evidence-based practices. If we were to say to counties only do evidence-based, we would be stuck with all we have today. We wouldn't be developing new programs and new ideas as we look at populations with changes. I want to say a couple things on caution. I am cautioning this committee. Oh, I do want to cover one other thing so that you know, which wasn't added into there. Every county is required under the JJCPA Act, the Schiff-Cardenas Act, to have a Juvenile Justice Coordinating Council. And I want to say that every county has complied with that. And on those councils, again, while it is required that probation is there, it's also required that there's alcohol and drug. It's also required, sir, that mental health is sitting at the table and community-based organizations. So a lot of your concerns, we make sure that happens under the current legislation that we have, not just law enforcement making a decision, but community representation is there also. So I would like to caution a couple things. One is I want to caution that we use the word evidence-based. While we support evidence-based, we also want to support research-based. We also want to support promising practices. We also have to be cautionary when we talk about early prevention, because it's very hard to tie early prevention to evidence-based in all cases, because you can't prove that in early prevention that child was actually going to join a gang. But yet it is, we know, prevention from gang activity later on. So we have to make sure that we continue to support those programs, because after school, every child in after school realistically isn't going to join a gang, but we still want to support after school because we know it decreases criminal behavior. So we want to make sure we do that. I also want to caution that not all evidence-based programs work with all cultures, and that we have to be very careful when an evidence-based program has served a pilot population to say that it will work in the Latino community or in the African American community. We have to make sure the projects work within the cultural competence within that community. So we have to be very careful with that, because we just don't want to take one program that maybe was working very well in Kansas and say it's going to work in South Central LA, because it might not, because of the cultural nuances. I also want to caution us about the consolidation. I want to be very careful, and I know Kurt mentioned this earlier, that when I looked at the recommendation, it said streamline all CSA-administered programs. I want to caution us that the federal mandate actually requires the state of California to have an oversight body that oversees all federal dollars. So I don't want to put us as a state in jeopardy of not following the federal mandate and, in fact, losing federal dollars. Because that, in fact, the federal government has been very clear with us that that could possibly happen if we move forward. I also want to caution us about how we prioritize our programs. And in the recommendation, I saw that the evidence-based programs will be defined by the Office of Gang and Youth Violence. I think you heard today repeatedly that there are national organizations that have been doing this for years, whether it's Washington State, whether it's the Blueprint from Colorado, to be able to use their expertise and their knowledge for us to define what our evidence-based. We don't have to think this up. It has been defined previously. So I want to end with what can we do? What can we do, and what I think I'm hearing throughout counties, is provide technical assistance. Is ability to reach out to counties, to have the clearinghouse that was recommended from the CPOC, to be able to say what works and how can we access what works. What can also we can do is what I hear that you're not always updated on what's happening with our programs. So to have an annual update from our programs to show, did they make a difference? Whether it's after school, whether it's juvenile justice, whether it's the camp dollars, to be able to actually come to you on an annual basis to the legislature to say, did it work and does it matter? So that you don't wait 2 or 3 years or have a special committee to say what's going on, but for us to actually institute an annual update. And the last thing on what we can do is to work with our current funding streams to be able to provide all of the technical assistance we can, not just in telling them about evidence-based practices, but in doing the training. We at CSA just released an application or a request for proposal in partnership with the AOC, the administrator of the court, to begin to train court staff on evidence-based practices and promising programs, to begin to continue to train probation so that when they see it locally, because they get more than just state dollars, we don't want them to just use state dollars in evidence-based and promising practices. We want them to use California Endowment and Cal Wellness and all of their dollars in this. So we need to train them on what that is and keep them abreast of that. So thank you very much for your time.
I think we have 2 comments, Assemblymember Perez and Assemblymember Valina. Okay. Did you want to make yours now?
Quick comment. I would just say that, and it's not meant to be a negative comment at all. I really don't mean it to. I think it's going to sound this way, so I'm qualifying it. I think you're just proving
my mother
the point.
does too when she corrects me.
Right. That actually proves the point or makes the argument in my mind that we have no idea what's going on in any of this stuff, and we need to have better management of it. And maybe you're the person, the entity to do it, but I think you're making a point that on the cautions, but also what we can do. We don't really know what is happening with all these dollars and all these programs that go out there. And I would argue that we can't, if we aren't pushing for evidence-based, then, how do we just continue funding all of these sort of, programs? Or they've got to be organized in certain categories we can understand, where we have priorities so that when we do hit funding crisis, we know where we're going to pull back from and where we're going to focus it on. And then when money is restored, if it is, that we can expand those back out. We don't want to lose federal dollars for sure, but I guess maybe it's just me, but by listening to you, I realize we've heard everybody on this table, some others earlier, and you. It seems like everybody's operating in these different silos. Nobody's organized. It seems confusing, and we need to fix that.
Okay, I guess let me clarify on the evidence base. With all of the federal dollars we actually work with both evidence base. What my comment is that we also do promising practices, which is required by the federal government.
Yeah, so you want seed money to do those for sure.
Right, yeah, so we need that combination between both of them. And so my comment is that we support evidence-based, but we also support promising practices and something that the federal government calls research-based, because the difference is that they've been evaluated, but they might not have been replicated. So if I was unclear about that, that's our support.
No, but let me ask you this quick question, and I'm sorry, we're turning into a dialogue, but if the chair and the vice chair were to say today, okay, of all the money that you mentioned, $1.3 billion, we only have $200 million. Now choose, what are you going to do? What would you choose? Would it be in prevention? Would it be in all these programs? Would you take a haircut across everything? I think what we're trying to get at is what are the priorities and put them into categories that we can manage? I mean, literally, what would you do if you had $200 million for all those things you just talked about?
Early prevention programs. And
right, I would agree with that.
Across our state, that if we actually work within community. I want us to prevent a kid from ever meeting probation. No offense to probation, and I like probation. Or to law enforcement. If we actually back up, one of the things like even truancy programs, that's early prevention. We see historically in the Latino population, kids in the hall are kept in the hall because of previous truancy. So if we actually back up and go into the community and work with our schools and our community-based organization in partnership with probation and put our monies in the front end, we're going going to have less moving forward. So that's what we're really talking about is prioritization. Can I just say in the San Diego, and I'll wear that hat because I serve on the Juvenile Justice Coordinating Council, we do not make a funding stream without looking at the percent of every dollar we put in prevention, intervention, and suppression, and we make sure that 75% of our money is in prevention and intervention and not suppression. So we fund the front end of that. So.
Thank you. Okay. Next, please.
Good morning. My name is Glenn Backus, and I represent the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. We have two campaigns that are directly interested in what you're discussing today. One is Books Not Bars. We represent families of incarcerated youth incarcerated in the DJJ. There's no law enforcement group more committed to the kids not getting in trouble than the parents of the kids who are incarcerated. So we're working for a policy system that will work for those families and for those youth. Our other campaign is the Green Collar Jobs campaign, whose founding motto was green jobs, not jails. So I would like to support from both of those campaigns what Mr. Seeves said early, that if he had to put his money on something, it would be on job training. So there's clearly a lot of work in California to deal with climate change, swapping out windows in low-income housing, taking care of our trailer parks in our cities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That work can be done by adults who need work and job training for our young people. That is part of the crime prevention package. More to the point of what you're discussing today, Books Not Bars and the Ella Baker Center is concerned about the haircut, the cuts to every sector of government except corrections. We've had cuts in early childhood education. We've had cuts in our schools and our after-school programs and our dropout prevention projects. Mental health funding has been cut. These are all part of crime prevention for young people and for families and communities. I did see the number, but I haven't seen the statutory changes to make it happen. Yes, sir. I think that's an important cut, except it's conceptual. We would like to suggest that in evaluating evidence-based programs, that counties do not need to be afraid of having some part of the money set aside for evidence-based, that the federal government, the DOJ, under President Bush, developed a list of evidence-based programs. Clearly, a proportion of our money should be on those evidence-based programs, and a proportion of our money should be for development of new and better practices that are appropriate to the communities. Also counterproductive of what we're currently spending on is that large warehouse facilities run by the state or by counties are not productive in preventing gang membership and preventing crime. Some youth who come into these settings, because they are so large and they are so unsafe, join cliques or gangs for their own preservation, and those memberships follow them out. We would suggest that the evidence is clear, that small programs of 30 or fewer, supervised by educators, counselors, and correction staff, will have better outcomes in the long term for gang prevention and crime prevention. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. I will make my comments brief. Elizabeth Howard on behalf of the California State Association of Counties. You've certainly had a broad array of excellent speakers this morning. I only wanted to associate myself primarily with the comments from probation, parochial, I assume. County boards of supervisors have a broad range of responsibilities, certainly, including probation, mental health, substance abuse, foster care, child welfare services, that all touch the same population that we're talking about today. We've been greatly involved in discussions over the years about how we best treat our youth. I would certainly agree that probation is a linchpin in that system. There are tentacles to the juvenile justice system that go beyond probation. I would also agree with Ms. Pink's perspective that while it certainly doesn't make sense to have this fragmentation, and this is a very worthy conversation that needs to continue, there will be I think it would be useful to have policy discussions about what it would mean to consolidate and what we might lose. We also are supportive of the role that the Correction Standards Authority has had. We have a very good relationship developed with a broad multi-agency board that has both local and state representation, and think that keeping a leadership responsibility and even potentially this technical assistance model we're talking about with the board would be a good use of resources. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next.
Hello, my name is Pam Handel, and I do not represent any organization at all that would be talking about grants in any way. I am a special education teacher, and I work in DJJ. And I just wanted to say a couple of things. All of the programs that people have talked about today from Department of Education would be near and dear to any educator's heart, because that certainly would talk about the prevention. I have for years and years told my boys, because I work with young men, I want you to put California Youth Authority, now DJJ, out of business by changing your behavior. Well, I've worked for California Youth Authority DJJ since we had the 10,000 and now the 1,600. And I work at CHAD in Stockton, and I work on the living unit that has the most mentally ill students. There's a lot of things that we can no longer prevent in any way for them. But the programs that you are going to be looking at, that would be working with possibly probation, the mental health end of things, any way that you can put money into helping them after they leave us. Because if they don't have the continued help that we give them, the treatment that has increased greatly in the last few years, the education, if we do not continue that as a society, I suppose, they will recidivate in horrible ways because of their mental illness if it's not addressed. So please, as you're thinking of these things, look into the things that would be going into probation. I'm asking you that as someone who really advocates for these students. In answer to the cuts to CDCR a few minutes ago, I have been privy to see the package of the layoffs that are proposed and the SORA notices that will be going out, and they are overwhelmingly in education and mental health. The mental health that has been recently increased and education. We're going to be taking a lot of cuts in medical, mental health, and education in DJJ. We will work really hard. We worked really hard before we got the people that we're going to lose, and we're going to continue to work hard with our kids. We have always known in DJJ that the key answer to recidivism is not everything we send them out with, because we send them out pretty well prepared. And a lot of people don't know that. But it's what happens afterwards. And if these folks don't have the money that they need to help these students, they will end up being those mentally ill lifers in the adult division. So I'd just like to have you think about that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. It's 11:20 something, and we need to wrap this up. So there were some recommendations. I've been having discussions with the vice chair about kind of packaging the first four recommendations kind of into one overarching one, and that has been handed out to the members. And that recommendation would read, state agencies that administer youth crime prevention or juvenile justice programs shall seek to consolidate similar programs into block grants to be distributed to local agencies. The state's role would be to distribute money in an equitable manner, require evidence-based programs, and determine outcomes that will be measured. The state shall work with local programs that show poor outcomes to improve the programs or shift money to more successful programs. So that would be kind of one all-encompassing one in lieu of the first four that were mentioned in the packet. Again, to the extent feasible, to be clear, to the extent feasible under current law, in state law, or federal mandates. That would be one recommendation. The second recommendation would be the breakdown of funding. The headline of it is Proposed Recommendation Regarding Evidence-Based Programs, and this addresses some of what was said earlier, that we start shifting toward 50% of funding for evidence-based programs by 2010-2011, 75% 2011-2012, and then 85% in 2012-2013, with the balance being those research-based or innovative programs that we were talking about. So we leave an allowance for that. But again, evidence-based is not. We need to go down that path. In fact, Washington State and Oregon State have done this. Washington State did it in 1997, and Oregon did it in 2003. This isn't new, this kind of a path. So those would be the two recommendations, and there's a third. It's not a recommendation, it's more a comment to all the panelists, that we get brief performance reports from you on the programs that you're administering. Any data that you have, any information that you have in terms of who the population that is being served, and any kind of outcomes that you might have. So the first is the overarching one that we just handed out. The second is regarding the funding streams, and that's it, those two.
Mr. Chair, I really appreciate your vision for the reform and transparency and clearly savings that need to be achieved within the programs for juvenile justice. And I was here as a staffer in the mid to late 90s when we took on welfare reform and block granted the funds that the feds had given us down to the local level. And our first two speakers talked about how most of the work that's being done for juveniles is done at the local level, and they know best what they need. And so the needs for, Mr. Valine's district in Fresno may be different than mine. In Ventura County may be different from Mr. Emerson's in the Inland Empire. And so it's important that we give the people who are the experts and who are on the ground the flexibility and discretion to be able to fund those programs that work best. I do believe that we have duplication. I do believe that we have waste, excessive administrative costs within juvenile justice programs, and I think that's been pointed out here today. I definitely believe that there are places for streamlining and for savings, and I'm hopeful that our recommendation here can be fleshed out and can become legislation as our different proposals have from this committee, and that will reform the way we administer programs to juveniles and make some very serious and needed changes in those programs, not only for the taxpayers but also in the lives of each of those juveniles who needs to find the right path.
Thank you. Assemblymember Perez.
Thank you, Chairman De La Torre. You brought up the point about the resources, I think, and the funding streams. I guess my concern is access to those resources and funding streams and making sure we know exactly where those dollars are going, specifically on the ground to the locals, right? And so I can appreciate the point that was made about the fact that throughout the state of California, we have these commissions and boards that are not diverse. In other words, they not only consist of public safety folks, but they also consist of folks from the community and nonprofits. I get that. I've been part of those groups. The struggle that I have there, though, is the access to resources, the dollars that even though these folks that are from the nonprofits or from our communities that are going to these commissions, they're not receiving any of the monies to deploy, to implement the programs on the ground, right? And I can tell you that because I've experienced that and I've seen it. Now, once again, the money of the question of resources and money going towards education, that's great. I get that. But where, right? Is it going towards prevention? Or once again, is it going towards suppression, right? And we have to ask those questions. Is it going to mental health counselors in our schools? Is it going to at-risk teachers? Is it going towards truancy counselors? Is it going towards restorative justice? Is it going towards early childhood development literacy programs? Maybe. Maybe not. Right? And so I think that that's a question that needs to be raised, and as well as we're talking about the reporting that's being made, that we think through where those dollars are actually going on the ground locally. Are they actually going to our nonprofit organizations that have been doing great work for many, many years and are just getting by because of soft monies that are coming from the foundation world? I'm willing to say that most of those groups survive off that soft money for the most part. I do appreciate the point about cultural competency. I think that's there's a lot of truth to that. You implement a program, for example, in the city of Coachella, doesn't mean necessarily that same program is going to work in East LA. And even though we're talking about Latinos in Coachella or Latinos in East LA. So I think that I can appreciate that point that was made. And just a thought or a question, a point for all to consider. To what degree do zero-tolerance policies in our schools have an impact in the juvenile justice system? Some of these zero-tolerance policies may be, we talk about the dropout rates. Well, what about the push-out rates that we actually conduct in our own schools and systems? Now, I'm not against zero-tolerance policies when it comes to, for example, youth bringing a handgun, for example, or a knife. I get that, right? But, a 4-year-old child or a 6-year-old child or even a 7-year-old child bringing a fork to school, right? And because we have a zero-tolerance policy, that fork may be seen as a weapon, and is expelled from school, right? And so that in itself already begins that process of incarcerating our kids and eventually the over-incarceration of our youth. And so just some points that I felt that I wanted to make. But once again, the reporting of the dollars, access to resources, specifically to the ground, to our locals.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to move the recommendations that were outlined by the chair earlier.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Call the roll.
De La Torre.
Aye.
De La Torre, aye. Strickland. Strickland, aye. Arambula. Berryhill. Berryhill, aye. Block. Buchanan. Caballero. Emerson. Emerson, aye. Fletcher. Fuentes. Fuentes, aye. Hagman. Hagman, aye. Huber.
Aye.
Huber, aye. Jeffries. Jeffries, aye. Jones. Jones, aye. Krikorian. Lowenthal. Perez.
Aye.
Perez, aye. Valines. Valines, aye.
Thank you all very much. That measure passes. I want to, as we're walking out here, I wanted to recognize India Williams, who is an intern in my office, who worked with the staff of the Accountability Committee over the summer, and she extended her internship to be able to complete her work on this project here today. So, India, thank you. Thank you all very much. We'll be meeting at the end of September is our next meeting, members. We will be back after session is over.